The Shadow War is the centerpiece of the entire Babylon 5 storyline, and so it was naturally surprising to many people that once Season 4 came along, it rapidly moved towards the conclusion of that story. And even today, with our serialized television being fairly standard, nevertheless resolving at a quarter of the way through a season is rather unprecedented. Yet it is fully in keeping with what this show was. Babylon 5 showed us that war was ugly. It showed us how close humanity as a species came to the brink of extinction. It showed how fervor leads the unthinkable to become policy. Babylon 5 was our last best hope for peace. The fleet that Sheridan led went to reclaim peace, not by imposing peace through overwhelming might, but by demanding it as the only resolution to the crisis that the two sides had created. This was not a campaign to victory. It was about a campaign to get all sides to lay down their arms. In light of that, the idea of resolving the plotline in this way, of not overwhelming evil, but rather recognizing and addressing the causes of conflict, fits in with what the show was supposed to be. The theme of this arc is found in the opening titles of this season, two separate lines. It was the end of history, and it was a new age. The old gives way to the new. The time comes when change is needed because what was has outlived its usefulness. While the conflict is between Vorlons and Shadows on the surface, underneath this is where the true conflict was. Rigid, hollow philosophies rather than flexibility and growth. Perhaps nowhere is this seen better than in the storyline which follows Lorien. In episode 6, he mulls about immortality with Ivanova and the change that took place. He was the first of the first ones, who are without age. They can die from disease or injury, but he alone of his species has avoided that all these long years, at least here in our galaxy. Then came the other first ones, but eventually others came along, with aging and death becoming the norm. And he shepherded the rest of the first ones as they arose, who then gradually went beyond the rim. But with the younger races, as established in the last season, the Shadows and the Vorlons were here to do this for the other races now. But what we should now recall is Lorien discussing death throughout this arc. First, let's start with Sheridan in the cave, metaphorically speaking. Lorien's point to Sheridan was that he had become trapped, a point between tick and tock, with tock meaning to die. Lorien told him over and over what he needed to do, which was to let go, surrender himself to what comes next. Only then would Sheridan have a future, a chance to move on with wisdom and clarity. This is the same as going beyond the rim. Too long of the first ones remained in the galaxy, their incautious footsteps impacting the younger races. Too long of the Vorlons and Shadows used the two sides in a proxy war purely in the name of philosophy. Only Lorien has remained silent, hidden, waiting for someone to come to him, to allow things to go as they should. He's the one who convinces the rest of them that it is time to take the next step, as scary as it might be, to go from the known to the unknown, to finally surrender themselves to Tok in a leap of faith. The second is Lorien's explanation about the transformation that took place regarding this life and death. The first ones, being immortal, were kept in check by a low birth rate. But he says when the newer races came along with their finite lifespans, he considered it an improvement. Quote, "To appreciate life, for there to be change and growth, life had to be short." And he speaks of the problem of immortality, that over time, Things that we cherish, like love and joy, are left behind because they are transitory. What the Vorlons and Shadows became are a consequence of their immortality, that the reasons for their philosophies melted away and left only the philosophies themselves, perpetuating the philosophies purely for their own sakes and rather for any of the foundation for them. The Shadows believed in conflict producing the strongest through survival of the fittest, yet this snuffed out lives before they could reach their full potential. The Vorlon believed in advancement through order, but simply judged the loss of life as acceptable to a supposed greater good, yet that greater good was merely to support stagnation. Lorien offered the third way, which is what was needed. For there to be change and growth, life had to be short. In other words, the cycle of birth and death, and the metaphorical way that to surrender to death allows rebirth, just rebirth on the level of the species, to continue to strive forward with new ideas instead of fighting for old ones solely because we have always fought for these ideas. This is symbolized by what happens in this battle. The younger races band together and stand as one in defiance of the old ones. It has been said to the effect that in war, the young die to satisfy the grievances of the old. That is what we have witnessed, the younger races constantly being attacked, culled, or exterminated in an endless conflict between two sides that refuse direct confrontation themselves. What we see has happened is both sides succumbing to the worst aspects of what they believe. The question of the Vorlons is, who are you? And of the Shadows, what do you want? Both questions ask you to look within, to glean an understanding of self merely from opposing directions. Who are you is self-reflection upon your identity. What makes me be who I am, and knowing myself to decide my future then. What do you want is understanding your drives to then understand yourself. Does my self-image match what I choose or would choose? Londo was perfect for the Shadows because he knew what he wanted, and it differed from G'Kar. G'Kar wanted revenge, but nothing more than that, and that was why they rejected him. They had no use for such an empty thing. What Londo wanted was a step backwards, yes. He kept referring to the way things were. I want us to be what we used to be. But this is showing that the answer to what do you want is about identity and what knowledge of oneself and one's desires are to achieve growth, to be better, fits in that shadow way of looking at yourself. But while the actions of the Shadows may result in military strength, the Centauri once again have a respected and vast empire, but it is beset by rot. Its authorities lack unity, are corrupted by decadence, and the Emperor is literally mad. They have more power, but they have not shed the flaws that led to their previous modest state. The Vorlons, though seemingly beneficial, reveal, ironically, who they are in this season. They have presented themselves as angels and guided in the name of order. Yet that guidance is limited. They are ivory tower intellectuals who do not even wish to be viewed when it is not to manipulate us. They may want us to look within to seek for growth, yet they still expect our unquestioning obedience. They claim to balance the chaos of the Shadows with order, but it leads to rigidity. Growth and change are stymied by a lack of flexibility. Kosh alone was radical enough to try to at least somewhat work towards true growth, trying to give Sheridan understanding. His sometimes infuriating answers were meant to change the way to think so that Sheridan could answer his own questions. Yet other Vorlons are intolerant of such things, expecting the younger races to do as they are told, fight when told to fight, and to die if it was needed. The arc certainly shows the Tolkien influence in many of its aspects. Sheridan being presumed dead, lost down a bottomless shaft, only to return reborn so that his task can be completed. This is clearly reminiscent of Gandalf's famous fall and return as Gandalf the White. The departure of the Vorlons, Shadows, and rest of the First Ones beyond the Rim certainly calls to mind the departure to the Undying Lands, especially with Sheridan calling this the Third Age with the Old Ones gone, and the departure in Lord of the Rings beginning the Fourth Age, the Age of Men. Even what was to come, the need to vanquish the corruption of Earth that was Clark's Totalian rule, a last remnant of the Shadows' manipulation, likewise points to the need of the hobbits to fight the corruption brought to the Shire by Saruman. But in the characters we see how they respond to the escalation of crisis to the breaking point. Delenn moves beyond grief to lead, even if the odds of success are low, because it is better than doing nothing. And yet this desperation does not break her spirit. She remains true to her principles even when it comes to physical danger. Jakar completes his journey from the selfish, hate-filled villain to a man who risks his very life for an enemy who had been willing to accept his friendship. A man who had everything but his dignity stripped from him, and then freely gave up even that if it was the price to end the suffering of his people. Who lost an eye and from it gained wisdom and insight. There's Vir, the man who Londo joked frequently about how out of step he was with everyone else, his lack of treachery and conniving, his honesty and empathy, are revealed by the contrast with his actions here. That they are strengths and not weaknesses, though, because when he had to, he chose to end a life when there was no other choice open before him. Yet, this did not betray who he was by that action. Instead, it revealed him as a man who would sacrifice all future peaceful night sleeps to save a world, even if it came at the cost of a piece of his soul. And Londo proves to be the man of the moment, building alliances on one hand while courting the Emperor on the other. Yet for all talk of necessity, felt that he would have to pay in the end for his part in the calamity that the Centauri now had. And for all the lives that he took because they were necessary, all the lives he sacrificed because they were necessary, Londo was fully ready to be killed himself to spare Centauri Prime when he thought it was necessary. Londo the Patriot, who started this to restore the Centauri, was prepared to die to save it. This arc is a strong piece that shows the culmination of many of the threads that stretch back to the show's very beginning, and it's not afraid to be reflective or philosophical in this. Yet it still offered up the dazzle that the concept of such a major engagement suggested. While this ended the storyline quickly, it was, in the end, true to itself, as both a series and to what it represented.